Compression isn't just about turning things down. It's about controlling dynamics to increase perceived loudness. Technically, compression reduces the difference between loud and soft parts of a signal. It lets us raise the level without clipping. Psychoacoustically, a compressed signal has less contrast. That smoothness tricks the brain into hearing the source as more present. This matters for loudness because it allows us to keep a source focused and feeling like it's in our face without overdriving meters or having massive transient spikes miles ahead of the rest of the music just waiting to be devastated by a limiter. We need to think of compression as a way to add balance and restraint to our mixes. If we squash everything, a mix will feel small and lifeless. So we have to think of compression as a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, when it comes to trying to craft loud mixes. So as you could probably predict, we are going to focus on these techniques with using the drums, because as always, it allows us to really understand the transient information, how that's being impacted, and also provides some really clear opportunities for our ears to latch on to things. However, some of the concepts we're going to discuss can apply to bass, to vocals, to a whole host of opportunities and source information inside your mix. But first, when it comes to crafting a loud mix and thinking about the role of compression, we want to think of two different types of compression. The first type is called serial compression, or what I call serial compression, and I'm pretty sure it's probably known as serial compression, although I think I've heard it called like functional compression. And then we're also going to talk about what everybody talks about, which is parallel compression. So we won't spend an absolute ton of time on that, because I'm sure if you're watching this and you're super excited, you probably already understand some basic concepts around parallel compression. But what serial compression does, its philosophy is we don't want one compressor to do all the heavy lifting on a sound source or the mix in general. What I have found when messing around and experimenting with compressors is most compressors, when you get over 5 decibels of gain reduction and start kind of getting up into, 7, 8 dB, you start to really hear the character of that compressor, the way it grabs things, the way it kind of can shift tonality, the way it kind of can reform or re-energize transients or blunt transients. You really start to hear the way it grabs on and lets go. Certain compressors are known to be a little bit more transparent and can be pushed into higher ranges of compression. But for the most part, I always feel that once I get to around 5 to 7 dB of compression, I'm going to start to hear that compressor's character. And if my goal is to get something loud, but I don't want the compressor to start imparting a lot of character, I'm going to want to stack compressors in order to share that heavy lifting. So let's take a look at that in the world of the drums. We have our drum bus here, and I'll hit play and we'll hear the drums going. Okay, now this drummer did a very solid job playing, but I would want you to think of this next point when you're evaluating the bass in your mix, when you're evaluating the vocal in your mix, and definitely when you're evaluating the kick and snare, because you might be recording your own stuff and might not be too seasoned on a particular instrument, or you might be working with bands that don't have really seasoned studio veterans who really understand how to stabilize what it is they're doing to create a nice, consistent, and full tone when it comes to translating through microphones and in the world of recording. But what you don't want with your bass lines, with your vocals, with your kick and snare is to feel this. Especially if you're going for a loud mix. The way that we perceive something being loud is being in our face. And when we're thinking of our mix, especially things that occupy the center of the mix, we want them, especially when we're going for loud again, to feel very firm and very stable. They're not moving. So the vocal, the snare, the kick, and the bass line should feel anchored like this, because if they're fluctuating, we're going to perceive that as distance, and that's going to impact the perceived loudness, the volume of what we're hearing. It feels like the vocal's sinking back. Well, it might feel like the vocal's getting lower, which now doesn't make it feel as loud. Or if the snare drum isn't as consistent from hit to hit, it's varying. That's not going to lead to the presence and stability that we need for something to feel loud and in your face. So we're going to use serial compression as a way to stabilize that. Let's look first at what would happen to this drum bus if I decided, I want to bring the kick and snare back to the pack a little bit here. Close the gap on the cymbals and kind of glue this kit together, and I'm going to use this API and I'm going to drive hard into it because I want, some energy and I want a little bit of compression. Like I want to feel some compression. So asking the API, which we have at a slow attack, so we're already telling it let as much through as you can and fast release. Don't grab and hold for a while. Let's listen. You could hear it most around the cymbal, right? When the drummer hits the cymbal, you feel the API just pull everything down. It does what an API is supposed to do, right? The second we kick it on, you hear the snap added to the transients, which is awesome. But we're getting a lot of grabbing and pumping. So let's listen to that in the mix and see what happens.
I've been telling myself this for days. I don't ever wanna go down and burn and fire a nuclear race. Now I'm cool and it feels like I'm living my youth.
So we love what it does with the transients, right? Like it's awesome. Like, oh man, that's great. But we're getting that pumping and it feels like the drums are kind of flexing, pushing, and kind of pulling like a sponge in a sense. Or a sponge doesn't push and pull. I don't know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about though. So here we are. We like what we're getting from the compression, but we don't like the pumping and we don't like what it's doing to the drums in terms of ducking the cymbals and kind of, losing a little bit of its presence. Okay, so now let's take a look at what we can get with the serial compression where we're trying to cement in the drums to the center of the mix. We don't want it flexing like we're pushing into, some spandex or latex or anything like that. So first up, we have the CLA. Let's listen to where we were with the regular API, and we could see 6 dB when the snare's hitting, and then when that cymbal crash is, we're going up to between 10 and 12. CLA, we have the fast attack and the fast release again, 8-1, and here we go. That's night and day, right? Between the two. Like the API feels small by itself and you hear it pumping and we're actually pushing. Like I went past it just to kind of prove a point that when you work in tandem and you're not asking one to do all the lifting, that you can get a cleaner, more open sound and also have it cement itself in the mix. And we are getting probably close to, on regular hits, like we're somewhere up around 6 or 7 decibels. Let's see. Yeah, like let's go a little further. You can see on those cymbal crashes on the API, we almost reached where the other one was, but it sounds totally different. So again, you can apply this to bass guitars, to vocals, where we're looking to kind of make sure that a whole melody line stays nice and consistent. And, between chord 1 and chord 3, we don't have these, massive volume jumps or it feels like one chord is disappearing inside a progression. That's where serial compression comes in really handy and will definitely help us to keep the drums in your face, which is a major must for a loud mix. So now staying with that, we'll now look at parallel compression. And what I brought into the session here are 3 parallels that I normally use on my mixes. But I actually don't really use these in parallel. I have a 4th one that I didn't bring in that this now drum serial bus is taking the place of, which is just a regular unprocessed channel. So I call these my drum mult, which is up here. So I send my main drum mix into 4 different compressors, very similar to like what Michael Brower does overall with his entire mix, and 1,000 other people have done with 1,000 different things. So this is not some groundbreaking thing that I'm coming up with. It's just a technique that I really like and find extremely useful for helping me to get quickly to my desired drum sound. So I have these 3 tracks below, one labeled punchy, and I have a couple compressors that I will keep on this in my template and I will audition them because punchy, again, is a subjective term and each song might need a different type of punch. So we're not going to get too hung up with that right now. For this punchy, I am using the Cush Audio, the AR1, and just kind of have it dialed into a setting that makes the drums feel pretty punchy. I'll show you that in a second. Then for my crispy one, I also use or will toggle between the Cush Novatron or essentially a plug-in version of the Compex. I actually have a real Compex sitting here. It's not a flex statement, but I prefer it actually to the plugins. But sometimes I will just toggle between, and this one is kind of a very explosive sound. They do a cool thing of kind of like splatting the transient a little bit, and that's what the goal of the crispy bus is I try to splat the snare drum. Punchy kind of gives the transients knock. That's the compressors that I audition, that each one of them, like we hear with the API, will give the transient some push to it, some more intensity. And then I have this crispy one that's designed to give the transient a little bit more body. So the front of it splats a little bit. So it's, as you can see here, a very fast attack, a slower release, and doing a solid amount of compression, and I'm kind of just driving into it. But I do have the side chain rolled off because I don't want it messing with the kick or the low end too much and becoming pumpy, because the goal is to keep the drums natural, just to be able to bring in some different flavors and blend them together. And then cooked is just the drums set to decimate, to decimate them. So I have the TG, and where I use it as the limiter, which has that crazy pumping sound. So this one is supposed to be super pumpy. What I have as my default right now is also a Cush Audio, and it's just set to their Fury mode, and side chain up a little bit because I don't want it to totally blow the kick up, but a little bit more, letting a little more in than I did on the other. So here's what we want to notice with this, with getting loud and where parallel compression comes in. So for anybody that is new to understanding parallel compression, is what we're essentially doing is we are taking the original source and we are feeding it through, but then we are taking a copy of that original source and we are splitting it off and we are putting a different type of processing on it. Typically what we do that for is to allow us to create something that we feel the original source is lacking, and then blend them together to get the right balance of what it is we feel we need to complement that original source that's going through. So you can't, and I would highly advise not getting into parallel compression or parallel anything unless you really formulated opinions as to what you need that parallel to do for you. Because it's really easy to watch videos, right? How parallel compression beefs up what you're doing, this and that and this. But if you don't really understand the philosophy behind it, or when you're listening to your own material or to the stuff that you're given, can make a determination as to what am I lacking, you're only going to probably maybe tack on things. If you're just like, oh, this guy, EJ said to, use these settings for a cool parallel compression on your drums. But say your drums came to you completely different than my drums, right? Came to you with that vibe already intact because your recording engineer knew that they were going for that and recorded things more splatty or whatever. And now you take a splatty parallel compressor and throw that on top. You're only kind of doubling down on what you already have. So you really want to understand what you feel you're lacking and then create a parallel bus to help augment that. But we're going to keep an eye on and where this contributes to loud, because this isn't really just a parallel compression tutorial. This is how we can make things loud. We're going to look at what we're getting from this bus without any parallel compression. We're going to keep our serial compression on the main one, assuming that we like the way it's cemented in. And now what we want from the parallel, as we talked about, we have a punchy bus, a crispy bus, which is designed to kind of splat the transient, add some width and length to it. And then we have just a cooked one, which is just kind of blowing up the whole sound, which would essentially give us a roomier sound, which would be kind of like a volume thing where you get a lot of room and less transient. That also kind of tricks our brain into thinking that the sound is bigger because there's a little more space around it. So here we go first. I'll bring in first the punchy one. What we want to keep note of is the limiter. So I'm going to play this first and we'll see where the limiter is on the drums without any parallels. Okay, so without any parallels, we're around 17. Now let's start bringing in our parallels. And the first will be our punch. I'll bring it up past where we're at so you can really kind of hear it, and then we'll dial in and find a good sweet spot where we're just getting a little bit more knock on those transients, just a little bit more pushing them forward. I'm not super concerned about the transients. I think we have good transient information. What I'm really looking for is a little bit more width and density to the drums, some weight to stand up for when we start really kind of trying to push into a limiter. So you can hear when we engage this, we're getting definitely a little more snap in the transients. And what you may have noticed is we're not picking up that much more level. We're still at around maybe picked up like a little bit over a dB or somewhere in that area at the most for all the extra kind of punch that we just got. Now we'll bring in the crispy, which again is looking to lengthen out those transients, give what's going on a little bit more body. For this one, listen to the length of the snare drum. Where now it feels like when we hit the snare, it's longer. Like it's just got a little bit more to it. I'll take it in and out and you'll notice. And same with the drums themselves. It almost feels like it's exciting the shells. Like before the drums are like really tightly tuned and like in a really tight dry space. And now all of a sudden they feel a little bit more open and you feel like they're kind of exciting and getting a little bit more resonant. Cool. And again, we barely have anything and we are picking up just little bits of volume incrementally. All right, we'll take these two out for a sec. So you could hear with the cooked one that we're getting that pumping energy that was like too much when we had it just on our main drum bus and was doing a lot of destructive things. But we're taking the positive that we liked from it, that kind of like, energy swell, the, push and pull of the drum, making it feel like it's in a bigger space. All those cool things that we like, we can now add in at our taste. So let's put all these in together and let's see what we end up getting on the meters. Overall, maybe a little bit over a dB, but you could hear a dramatic difference when they're not in. The drums feel very small, they feel lifeless. Now let's take a quick listen to those in the mix. I'll start with them out and then we'll put them in.
I've been telling myself this for days. I don't ever wanna go down and burn in fire nuclear rays. Now I'm cool and it feels like I'm living my youth. I don't wanna turn you around, although I predetermine your fate.
So the overall track barely moves, but we picked up an absolute ton of density. And that's what we're going to need, especially as we're trying to make the mix loud. And if we're pushing into a limiter, all these peaks up here, which are, the raw kick and snare, the limiter, as you can see already, is pushing back on them. And if we don't have parallels to help with, making the drums feel fuller, to also, help us rebuild some of that transient density, the drums are going to start to keep shrinking in the mix and feeling smaller and smaller as those transients get blunted and feel very thin and underwhelming, especially as everything else, like the low end of the mix and things start to come up to meet those transients that are poking way out right now, which are the things that make us hear the drums and feel a little bit of the intensity and the energy to drums. As they get smashed back into the pack and the drums aren't dense, they're going to start to feel very small and very lifeless. So I hope that you really found this conversation about serial compression and parallel compression very useful when it comes to building a loud mix. We're going to do a video later on which kind of demonstrates how to go through an entire mix and optimize it to be built to be as loud as possible. And in there, you're going to then see these tricks put to use. Well, not tricks, you're going to see these techniques put to use. But in the meantime, I would absolutely implore you to go and have some fun and experiment with these on your own. One additional thing I could mention regarding serial compression is sometimes it's pretty cool to stack a third compressor. So you could think of the first one as taming the transients, the second as riding the body, and then the third, something like a Fairchild, which would do, completely minimal stuff, as adding some vibe. So that's where you can go with like a vibe compressor. A great second compressor in serial compression typically is something like an opto compressor, something that's a little slower to grab. But because I really wanted this to be a fair comparison, we stuck with the API here. But if I was doing serial compression on a bass or a vocal or even this drum, and I wasn't really concerned for demonstration purposes and trying to help, guide your ear to hearing certain things, having something a little slower here to let that transient come through and really focus on the body and cementing that tone like smack dab in the middle of the mix without any kind of artifacts, without any kind of pumping or anything like that, I would probably also look to reach for an opto compressor. And then you could stack a third behind it for vibe. So hope you had a good time with this. Feel free to let me know in the comments below if you have any additional questions. I know I didn't dive too deep into these compressors or why I chose them. I just wanted to make sure that we are talking about the concept of building density and the different ways to go about it when we're talking about loud mixes, not a tutorial on, different plugins to use for parallel processing. But if you have questions on that, don't hesitate to ask. You could also build parallel buses that are for transients, meaning like one that's just like a transient designer, like a punch. You could also build parallels that are strictly, say, using transient designers. You could build a parallel that is mid-range focused, so maybe has some saturation in the mids, and you could feed whatever instruments that you want to it in order to help kind of make something feel very loud and very forward. So there's all sorts of uses for parallel buses, and this is just, the tip of the iceberg in that. But what doesn't falter is the mindset of why you need a parallel and how to work that parallel into the mix to optimize your mix for loudness.